Doctors, what is the worst diagnosis? I work in pediatric medicine, and there's nothing that hits harder than a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis in a newborn. Knowing that this child will struggle with lung infections, frequent hospitalizations, and a shorter life expectancy is incredibly heartbreaking. It's tough for the parents who had dreams of a healthy child, and then reality sets in. And you can see the weight of that diagnosis on their faces, and it's hard to find the right words to comfort them. As an ER doctor, I've had to deliver some tough news. But one of the hardest was when I diagnosed a young woman with metastatic breast cancer. She was only 28 and had just gotten married. Her whole life was ahead of her. And to have to tell her that the cancer had spread and was terminal was one of the toughest moments of my career. The way her face fell and the tears that followed are etched in my memory. I once diagnosed a man in his 60s with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The idea that this vibrant, energetic person would gradually lose all his motor functions and eventually be unable to communicate or care for himself was devastating. I had to explain that there's no cure and that he'd face a long, painful decline. The way he looked at me, filled with fear and uncertainty, made me feel like I had crushed his spirit. As a surgeon, I had a patient in her late 30s who had been battling ovarian cancer for years. She had undergone multiple surgeries and rounds of chemotherapy, and each time we thought she was getting better, the cancer would return. So when we finally had to tell her that her cancer was terminal and there were no more treatment options available, the heartbreak was palpable. She had so much fight left in her, and it was devastating to see that extinguished. Working in a geriatric unit, I once had to tell a sweet, elderly man that he had advanced Alzheimer's disease. He had been struggling with memory issues for some time, but hearing the official diagnosis really hit him hard. The look of confusion and fear in his eyes when I explained the disease and its progression was heartbreaking. He kept asking if he would get better, and I had to gently explain that it was a progressive condition with no cure. I had a patient who was a single mother of 2 young children. When I had to tell her that she had stage 4 lung cancer, the room felt heavy with despair. She had never smoked a day in her life, and hearing that her time with her children was limited was gut-wrenching. We all cried together, and it was one of those moments that reminds you how fragile life can be. As a pediatric oncologist, I frequently see heartbreaking diagnoses, but one that stands out is when I had to tell a 10-year-old boy that his leukemia was no longer responding to treatment. His face dropped, and he just stared at the floor, processing what that meant. Watching him try to keep his composure for his mom, who was sobbing, was a moment that I'll never forget. During my residency, I had a patient diagnosed with Huntington's disease. It's a degenerative neurological condition that can lead to severe cognitive decline and loss of motor skills. Telling a 40-year-old father that he would eventually lose his ability to care for his children was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. He broke down, and it felt like the world had come crashing down on him. I once had to deliver a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis to a young woman who was an athlete and had big plans for her future. She was filled with hope and ambition, and seeing that hope shatter when I told her about the condition was heart-wrenching. I remember her asking, "Will I ever run again?" It's hard to watch someone's dreams fade right in front of you. As a palliative care physician, I see the impact of terminal diagnosis regularly, but one case that sticks with me is a young mother diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She had just welcomed her first child, and knowing she wouldn't get to see her grow up was utterly heartbreaking. She was filled with so much love and hope, and to take that away felt like a cruel twist of fate. I had a patient who was a bright, talented 18-year-old girl, and I had to tell her that she had a rare brain tumor. She had so much potential, and hearing that her life was about to change drastically and not for the better was incredibly difficult. The tears in her eyes were heartbreaking, and it made me realize how unfair life can be at times. I'll never forget the day I had to diagnose a little girl with severe combined immunodeficiency, SIDE. She was just a baby, and the reality that she would be extremely vulnerable to infections for her entire life was devastating. The parents were in disbelief and panic, and all I could do was offer reassurance while also preparing them for the long road ahead. As a family doctor, I often deal with difficult conversations, but the hardest was when I diagnosed a young father with advanced kidney cancer. He was only 34 and had a young family who depended on him. Watching his face go pale as the realization set in that he wouldn't be there for his kids was crushing. It made me reflect on my own family and how precious time truly is. One of my colleagues told me about a time he had to inform a woman in her 50s that she had been diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. She had been feeling unwell for some time, but never expected such a dire diagnosis. The shock and disbelief on her face were heart-wrenching, especially when she started to think about her children and how this news would affect them. I once worked with a patient who had just had a heart attack, and during our conversations, I discovered he had no idea how close he was to death. When I had to explain his condition and the lifestyle changes he needed to make to avoid another heart attack, it was evident that he was terrified. The idea of mortality hitting him so suddenly was heartbreaking, and it made me reflect on how fragile life can be. As a nurse in the oncology ward, I have seen a lot of heartbreaking moments, but one that stands out is when a patient was told they had only months to live due to advanced cancer. The way they broke down, sobbing for the life they wouldn't get to live, was something I'll never forget. It's moments like those that remind us of the importance of empathy in our profession. I had a patient who had been struggling with infertility for years, and when she finally got pregnant, it was a dream come true. Unfortunately, during her routine scan, we discovered that the fetus had a severe genetic disorder. Telling her that the baby she had wanted for so long might not survive outside the womb was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. The heartbreak was palpable, and we all shed tears together. As a pediatric nurse, I once had a young boy diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder that would severely limit his lifespan. And watching his parents' faces drop as I explained the prognosis was absolutely gut-wrenching. They had been so hopeful after he was born, and to see that hope turn into despair was heartbreaking. I was once a part of a team that diagnosed a teenage girl with lupus. Her symptoms had been dismissed for months, and when we finally confirmed the diagnosis, the relief was overshadowed by the reality of a chronic illness. The uncertainty about her future and the impact on her dreams and aspirations left her and her family feeling lost and heartbroken. As an internist, I had a patient who had lived a healthy life, but during a routine checkup, we found signs of liver failure due to undiagnosed hepatitis. Informing him that he would need a transplant and the reality of his situation was heart-wrenching. His tears and the fear of what lay ahead were tough to witness. I remember a case where I had to tell a young couple that their IVF attempt had failed. They had invested so much hope and emotion into this process, and when I had to break the news, the devastation on their faces was gut-wrenching. They had dreamed of becoming parents, and to have that hope crushed in an instant was heartbreaking to witness. One of the hardest moments of my career was when I had to inform a young man that he had been diagnosed with HIV. The look on his face was pure shock and disbelief. He had a bright future ahead, and seeing that hope vanish was one of the toughest parts of my job. It reminded me how important it is to approach these conversations with compassion and empathy. In my experience as an emergency room doctor, I've seen countless heartbreaking moments, but one that stuck with me was when I had to tell a young mother that her newborn had a severe congenital heart defect. The mother had been so excited and hopeful, and to see that hope turn to despair in an instant was truly gut-wrenching. I had a patient who was a bright young girl diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at a very early age. As she grew older, she struggled with the limitations of her condition. Watching her break down when she realized she would never be able to live life as freely as her friends was incredibly sad. The weight of that diagnosis at such a young age was heartbreaking for her and her family. A nurse I know shared a story about a mother who was told her son had a severe developmental disorder. The heartbreak in that room was palpable as the mother tried to process the information while looking at her son, full of potential but facing significant challenges. The uncertainty of his future left everyone feeling lost and devastated. One of my friends, who's a doctor, once told me about a time he had to inform a father that his child had a terminal illness. The father's reaction was one of disbelief followed by deep sorrow. The emotional weight of that moment was palpable, and my friend felt the burden of having to convey such heartbreaking news. It's moments like these that remind us of the fragility of life. As a mental health professional, I once had to diagnose a young man with severe depression and anxiety. He was so overwhelmed that he could barely function. And when I finally explained the severity of his condition and the long road ahead, the tears rolled down his face. He had lost hope, and trying to help him see a path forward felt almost impossible at that moment. In my practice, one of the most heartbreaking diagnoses I had to share was with a woman who had breast cancer that had spread to her bones. She was a single mother with 2 kids, and seeing her struggle to understand the implications of her diagnosis was heart-wrenching. The thought of her children growing up without her was a painful reality for both of us. I had a patient who came in for a routine checkup, and we ended up diagnosing her with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. The look of disbelief on her face when I explained the findings was gut-wrenching. She had been so healthy and full of life. and to have to tell her that her future was uncertain was one of the hardest moments I've experienced. As a physician in a rural area, I once diagnosed a young boy with a rare genetic disorder that would significantly limit his lifespan. The parents were devastated, and watching them grapple with the reality of their child's condition was heartbreaking. The questions they asked about his future and the life they envisioned for him felt like a weight on all of us in that room. In my years of practice, I've had to deliver many difficult diagnoses, but one that stands out was when I had to tell a father that his teenage daughter had a severe eating disorder. The shock and heartbreak in his eyes were palpable as he processed the gravity of the situation. Watching him try to hold it together for his daughter while she was clearly struggling was a moment I'll never forget. During my training, I had a patient diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder that had gone undetected for years. She was finally able to understand the cause of her debilitating symptoms, but the realization that it would be a lifelong battle was heart-wrenching. The fear of the unknown and what lay ahead for her was something I could feel in the room, and it was hard to witness. I remember a young couple who had been trying to conceive for years. When they finally got pregnant, they were overjoyed, only to learn later on that their baby had a life-threatening congenital condition. Telling them that their dreams of starting a family might be shattered was a moment filled with heartbreak and despair. It's tough to see such happiness turn into sorrow in an instant. I once diagnosed a woman in her late 30s with early-onset Alzheimer's. The fear and confusion in her eyes when I explained the implications of her diagnosis were heartbreaking. Knowing that she would eventually lose her memories, her independence, and the essence of who she was one incredibly tough for both of us. As a social worker, I once had a mother come to me after her child was diagnosed with autism. The weight of the world was on her shoulders, and seeing her struggle to understand and accept this new reality was heartbreaking. She kept asking what this meant for her child's future, and all I could do was hold her hand and listen as she cried. I once had to tell a patient that they had developed a severe, debilitating chronic illness that would drastically change their quality of life. They were still young and full of dreams, and seeing the realization sink in that their life would never be the same was gut-wrenching. The tears flowed freely, and all I could do was offer my support. As a healthcare provider, I had a case where a mother had to hear that her young son had a rare terminal illness. Watching her break down and seeing her shattered dreams was heart-wrenching. The pain and despair in the room were palpable, and it's one of those moments that reminds you of how fragile life truly is. I had a patient diagnosed with a life-threatening condition, and the moment I told her, I could see her whole world collapse. She was a single mother, and her immediate thoughts were about her kids and who would take care of them. The heartbreak in that moment is something I still think about years later. In my practice, I've had to tell families about serious diagnoses more times than I can count, but one that stands out is when a mother learned her child had a degenerative disease. The raw emotion in the room, filled with disbelief and fear, was absolutely heartbreaking. What's these moments that remind you of the deep emotional connections we have to our loved ones? A close friend of mine shared that during her training, she had to diagnose a patient with Huntington's disease. The weight of knowing the patient would gradually lose everything he held dear, including his memories and autonomy, was a burden she carried heavily. It's one of those moments that you wish you could take back, knowing how devastating the news would be. I once had to explain to a young woman that she had a severe chronic illness that would require her to make significant life adjustments. The fear of the unknown and the uncertainty about her future was palpable. Seeing her process the news, trying to grasp the reality of her situation, was a heartbreaking experience that I still carry with me. I had a patient who was finally expecting her first child after years of infertility. The joy quickly turned into sorrow when we discovered the baby had a serious genetic disorder. Telling her that the child she had longed for might not survive was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. The heartbreak and disbelief were overwhelming, both for her and for me. I once had to tell a young woman that her routine screening revealed early-stage cervical cancer. She had just gotten engaged and was so excited about her future. The moment I said the words, I could see her world shift. She started crying, asking if she would still be able to have children. It broke my heart to see someone's dreams hang in the balance like that. As a pediatrician, I've had to deliver tough news, but telling a young boy that he had type 1 diabetes was particularly challenging. But he was so full of energy, and when I explained that he would have to manage this condition for the rest of his life, I could see the light dim in his eyes. The fear of needles, blood sugar checks, and dietary restrictions hit him hard, and it was heartbreaking to witness. I had a patient in her late 50s who had been living a healthy lifestyle. When we found out she had stage 4 breast cancer, it felt like time stood still. She was so vibrant and full of life, and watching her face drop when she realized what this meant for her future was gut-wrenching. Her thoughts immediately went to her family, and the tears flowed as she processed her new reality. During my residency, I was part of a team that diagnosed a 12-year-old girl with leukemia. She was such a bright spirit, and her entire life was ahead of her. Breaking the news to her and her parents felt like crushing their dreams in an instant. Watching them process that devastating news was something I'll never forget, and it left a lasting impact on me. I once had to tell a mother that her son, who had been healthy, had developed a rare heart condition that would require surgery and a long recovery. The disbelief in her eyes was painful to witness, and as she broke down, I could feel her hopes for his future shatter. It's moments like these that remind us of the fragility of life. As a psychiatrist, I had to inform a young woman that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Her face turned pale as she processed what that meant for her life and her dreams. The fear of stigma and the uncertainty about her future hung in the air, and seeing her fear and pain was heart-wrenching. I once diagnosed a college student with testicular cancer during a routine examination. The shock on his face was evident, and his worries about how this would affect his life and future were overwhelming. He had so much ahead of him, and to see that taken away in an instant was devastating. One of the hardest cases I dealt with was a mother diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer shortly after giving birth. She was so young and had so much to live for. Watching her and a partner try to navigate the reality of her diagnosis while caring for their newborn was heart-wrenching. I had a patient who had just received a lung transplant. When he came in for his follow-up, we discovered that his body was rejecting the new lung. Telling him that he might lose the very thing he fought so hard to receive was one of the toughest moments I've experienced. The look of despair on his face is something I'll carry with me forever. In my practice as a family physician, I once diagnosed a middle-aged man with advanced liver disease. The way he collapsed into tears as I explained that his lifestyle choices had led to this diagnosis was heartbreaking. He felt a deep sense of regret, and the weight of what he had to face next was crushing. I remember a patient who had just given birth, and we discovered that her newborn had a severe congenital heart defect. Watching her try to process the news that her baby would require immediate surgery and potentially face a long and difficult life was devastating. The love she had for her child was so evident, and it made the situation even more heartbreaking. As a nurse in the oncology unit, I've seen many heartbreaking diagnoses, but one that stands out is when a young man in his 30s was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. He had 2 small children, and when he learned that his prognosis was grim, the emotional weight of that moment was overwhelming. It's hard to see a family's future turned upside down like that. I once had to inform a young athlete that she developed a degenerative disease that would limit her ability to play sports. The look of disbelief and fear on her face was gut-wrenching. She had worked so hard and sacrificed so much, and knowing that her dreams could be taken away in an instant was incredibly sad. I had a patient who was in her early 40s and had been feeling unwell for months. When we finally diagnosed her with stage 3 ovarian cancer, the reality of her situation set in hard. The tears she shed were filled with fear, sadness, and anger, and watching her come to terms with this new life was heartbreaking. In my experience as a surgeon, one of the toughest moments was when I had to tell a woman that her breast cancer had returned after 5 years of being cancer-free. She had built her life back up, and hearing that she would have to go through treatment again was devastating. The fear of the unknown came flooding back, and the pain in her eyes was palpable. As a pediatric nurse, I once had to tell a little girl that she would have to undergo chemotherapy for her leukemia. The fear in her eyes was haunting, and watching her struggle with the reality of losing her hair and being sick was gut-wrenching. The innocence of childhood collided with a harsh reality, and it was heartbreaking to witness. I remember the moment I had to tell a patient that his recent scans showed signs of advanced prostate cancer. He was a family man, and the immediate concern for his wife and children was evident. The tears he shed for the life he wanted to continue living were incredibly painful to witness. During my training, I encountered a young woman diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disorder. The realization that her life would be filled with constant pain and medical visits broke her spirit. Seeing her dreams for the future crushed by this diagnosis was a moment that weighed heavily on me. One of the most heartbreaking cases I had to deal with was a father diagnosed with terminal cancer shortly after he became a grandparent. The joy of welcoming a grandchild quickly turned to despair when he realized he might not get to see them grow up. It was incredibly tough to watch that joy fade into fear and uncertainty. As a nurse, I had a patient who was a vibrant teenager diagnosed with a severe eating disorder. The way she broke down when she realized the impact it had on her health was gut-wrenching. It's tough to see someone so full of life struggle with something that can consume them so entirely. I had a case where I had to inform a mother that her daughter had developed a rare neurological condition that would affect her mobility and cognitive abilities. The look of devastation in her eyes as she grappled with the reality of her child's future was heartbreaking. I once had to tell a patient that they had developed a chronic illness that would require lifestyle changes. The realization that their life would never be the same was hard for them to bear. Watching their dreams and plans for the future dissolve was gut-wrenching. During my practice, I've seen a lot of heartbreak, but one case that stood out was when a young woman learned she had a life-threatening heart condition. The fear and sadness in her eyes as she processed the implications for her future were palpable, and it was one of those moments that reminded me of the fragility of life. I had to inform a father that his son had been diagnosed with a severe developmental disorder. The heartbreak was visible on his face as he struggled to understand what this meant for his son's future. The weight of that diagnosis was heavy in the room, and it's moments like these that stick with you. I remember a case where a patient was diagnosed with a terminal illness shortly after getting married. The joy of starting a new life together was overshadowed by the weight of impending loss. Seeing their dreams for the future become tainted by fear and sadness was truly heart-wrenching. As a doctor, I had to break the news to a woman in her 30s that she had developed an aggressive form of cancer. The shock on her face was palpable, and as she grappled with the reality of her situation, it was evident that her hopes for the future had been shattered in an instant. I had a patient who came in for a routine checkup and was diagnosed with a severe heart condition. The realization that his lifestyle choices had led to this moment was difficult for him to accept. Watching him process the implications for his future was incredibly sad and heart-wrenching. I once had to tell a patient that she was pregnant, but the fetus had severe developmental issues. The look of despair on her face as she processed what that meant for her future was gut-wrenching. She had longed for this child, and to have her dreams turned upside down was truly heartbreaking. In my experience, one of the most challenging moments was when I diagnosed a young man with stage 4 testicular cancer. He was just starting his life, and telling him that his future was uncertain was devastating. Seeing the hope drain from his eyes was a moment that still haunts me. As a healthcare provider, I had to inform a mother that her child had a rare genetic disorder. The way she broke down and cried was heart-wrenching. You could see her hopes for her child's future slip away, and all I could do was offer my support during that difficult moment. I remember a time when I had to tell a father that his child was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. The way his entire demeanor changed, filled with disbelief and fear, was heartbreaking to witness. It's moments like these that reinforce the importance of compassion in our profession. I once diagnosed a woman in her 40s with an aggressive form of breast cancer. The look of shock on her face was hard to bear, and as she began to cry, I could see the weight of the world settle on her shoulders. It was devastating to see her hopes for the future crumble in that moment. Are you already subscribed? No? Please do, or you will miss out on all the other horrifying stories we will tell you.